All right, let's go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is David Wilhite, and I am the Community Director here at RCC. In a moment, I'll be introducing you to Amanda Stone, but first, just want to talk about a few housekeeping items. So, as you may have noticed, you are not going to be able to speak during this presentation. You're all muted. But you do have the ability to submit questions. So if you should see like a Q&A button on your Zoom. Please type those questions into the chat box or into that Q&A box. I'll be monitoring that. Nick will be monitoring that. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a quick Q&A session to try to address any submitted questions. And the session also will be recording for future viewing. And the other piece of that is Amanda will be reaching out after the webinar to all of you with a quick survey. She's also going to include the slides for the presentation in that email. And I do encourage you, if you can take the survey, Amanda let me know beforehand that her school, basically she's not making this up, right? We want to help her let her school know that she actually did this presentation. So yeah, brief intro to Amanda. If you don't know Amanda Stone, it's been an honor and a pleasure to get to know her over the last couple of years. She came to us a couple of months ago with this idea to speak to people about what she's learning at Richmont, specifically in the area of trauma. Of course, she was first thinking about a lot of the leadership, community group leaders, elders, and things like that. But as the more we talked about it, the more it made sense to really open it up to anyone in our congregation, because everyone's going to be dealing with trauma at some point in their lives themselves, or working, or being with someone they love who's dealing with trauma. So here we are. So with that, I will turn it over to Amanda.
Awesome. Thank you, David, for the warm introduction, and welcome to all of you who are joining. I'm so glad you're here. Before we get started, I do just want to let you know and preface this webinar, which that you signed up for a webinar about trauma, but talking about things like this can stir up emotions and memories. And so just take care of yourself. If you're noticing things are becoming overwhelming, take a step back, even step away from the computer. This is being recorded, so you can always go back to it at a later time, and don't hesitate to reach out to me or a friend or family member if something is just really overwhelming you. So I am not, okay, here we go. About me. This is me. I am pursuing my master's in clinical mental health counseling at Richmont. I am an intern right now. I serve 3 different sites. So that is why if I look tired on Sundays, that is why. 2 of them, First Baptist Woodstock and Hope Counseling Centers, are private practice settings, and they both offer low fee counseling. So I'm able to see a diverse range of clients from low socioeconomic status to high socioeconomic status. Really interesting. I primarily work with trauma in the private practice settings, and I love it. I see clients from about 19 to somewhere like in their 40s. I'm also at Willowbrook at Tanner. It's a psychiatric hospital in Villa Rica. I work with kids and adolescents aged 10 to 17 years old who are suicidal and homicidal. I'm also a part of a fellowship. It's a big, long name. Basically, all it means is I am getting to be trained to be better equipped to serve high risk and high need clients, which I just believe that as a believer, I feel really called to do that, to just embody Christ and hopefully emulate Christ to serve those marginalized populations. I've also done a lot of work with survivors of sexual exploitation. I have a paper right now that I worked on with Dr. Sonia Sutherland, talking about different effective residential treatment components for youth who are survivors of that. Worked with a few different ministries and nonprofits doing development work. So it's a little bit about me, but let's get started. We are going to start it off with a story, and we're going to end with a story. And as we do this, I hope it's just a way that you can start to understand what trauma actually looks like and what it could show up as at RCC. And so as we began, I would just encourage you to be curious about the reactions that you're noticing inside of yourself. Any judgment or confusion that arises, just notice that and pay attention to it. So Liam, also just to preface too, all of these stories are for illustrative purposes only. They are not based off any of my clients. Just want to say that to protect their privacy. So if for some reason they were to find this, they would know. Yeah, so Liam, he recently blew up on his spouse, and this has been a pattern that has been occurring in his life. And it's getting to be frightening. He's raising his voice. His kids are scared. His wife is scared. And it is just becoming this pervasive pattern. And it seems to be happening over things that seem very trivial. And his emotions are really signaling to him that they need his attention. They're cues and trailheads that maybe in the moment his wife actually hurt him. She didn't respond in the way that he wanted her to when he came home from work after a long day and was talking about what happened and was really upset. And this may have been what I like to call this phrase, a tiny paper cut. And I'll repeat this phrase throughout the webinar, but we can understand trauma as one big giant gash and complex trauma as a million tiny paper cuts that form into this big gash over time. And I'll get into that later. We'll expand on the metaphor. So if you're like, what is she talking about? Just hold on. So here's an example of one of these paper cuts with Liam. His wife may have said something that wasn't super nice, but she really didn't mean major harm. Maybe she was short with him. Maybe she just didn't have the perfect response to a need that he had in that moment. And he is having these big emotional reactions as if she just cut him to his core. And his wife is confused because she's like, I get it. I'm sorry that I didn't give you like the exact right response, but you know I love you. You know I'm here for you. And he is confused because he's thinking, I know, I know that. I just don't know why I exploded in that moment. And so there's these big emotions inside of him from all the way back, a long trail back to the past, and they're coming out in this small moment of infraction because his body does not experience it as one little paper cut or one little hurt. His body experiences it as 1,000,001 paper cuts. And that one paper cut is building on 1,000,000 over the course of his lifetime. And so he just doesn't have any reserves or any tolerance left. And in fact, it feels strange to us because his wife is someone who is safe. But actually, when he's in the presence of someone who is safe, those emotions, the backlog of emotions from his childhood, feels like they can begin to come out. And here's his backstory. Liam was raised by two parents who worked a lot. When they were home, they were distracted and distant. They were just exhausted trying to make ends meet. And so Liam spent a lot of his childhood alone. When he did approach his parents to play, connect, or engage, they shrugged him off, told him to go play with the neighbors. And at around age 10, Liam began to become highly disassociated. He stopped asking for his parents to join in what he was doing. And he shut down. He shut those emotions down, which means all the emotions, joy, anger, all of them combined. In his teen years, he spent most of his time at friends' houses. His parents took little interest in who he was or what he was doing. And the subconscious message that he began to receive was clear. Life is on you and adults cannot help. And by his adult years, Liam became heavily guarded and highly protected. He didn't know how to express his feelings, let alone identify others. And so Liam starts to have these big emotional responses with his wife, the first person that he has ever felt safe with. And clinicians use the term regressing to describe a moment like this, when Liam feels like that 10-year-old inside of him, right, when he started to become fully disassociated, that he may not even be aware of. It's it's starting to come out again. And he can think, I think I'm overreacting here, but all I know is I feel like that helpless, stuck child that I felt like in 5th grade. And so he has these big emotions and he doesn't know what to do with them. So hold on to your reaction to Liam's story. And yeah, just kind of remember that for the end. And let's get into what trauma actually is. The way I'm going to describe and differentiate between complex trauma, which we'll get into in a moment, and trauma is, again, understanding trauma as this singular event that creates this big wounding gash. Just think straight across the body. It's big, it's wounding, and it's much easier to recognize. So things like a car wreck or discovering a life-threatening illness that you just got, you have a month to live, learning about your friend being sexually assaulted. Trauma includes witnessing, learning, or experiencing death or threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violations. It can also include experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of these events. So think of first responders collecting body parts, police officers who are repeatedly exposed to child abuse, healthcare workers who are consistently treating physical injuries from domestic violence in the ER. What it doesn't include are events that are witnessed only on social media or TV or movies. And so you may be thinking like, okay, I can see that, but is that really in, like, how many people actually in the body of RCC have experienced trauma? And the prevalence is actually could be higher than what you may initially think. I know when I initially started to learn about this, it really surprised me. Studies have shown that 27% of women and 16% of men report sexual abuse or an assault attempt before age 18. Approximately 30% of women are sexually assaulted as adults. 70% of women who were sexually victimized as children are re-victimized as adults. 14% report physical abuse during childhood. 24% report emotional abuse during childhood, and girls are twice as likely to have been neglected, while boys are more likely to sustain a physical injury from a caregiver. So when we think about that, we can start to know, like, okay, this is probably in RCC, and it may be more prevalent than we actually think. So what does the impact of trauma actually look like? PTSD just stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a diagnosis in the DSM, which is like the Bible for counselors. People have differing opinions on it depending on what you believe about diagnoses, but it's helpful information for us to be able to look at these different symptoms and start to be aware of how this could be showing up in our church. So we'll get into it. Intrusion includes recurrent involuntary intrusive memories, flashbacks, and recurring distressing dreams. So the way that this may show up is you may start to hear a friend or a family member say, hey, I'm having a hard time focusing at work. I keep having, these random memories start to pop up in my head, and I'm having trouble focusing. I'm not really sure what that's about. Or someone who's just looking really tired because they're having these recurring distressing dreams. Avoidance, trauma survivors do great at making efforts to avoid distressing memories. Thoughts or feelings about are closely associated with the event. And so when we think particularly about spiritual abuse, this is important to remember, because when people who are survivors of spiritual abuse are walking into our church, their bodies are often, if they're experiencing post-traumatic stress, literally reacting with that fight, flight, fawn, or freeze, that adrenaline that courses through our bodies that is activated as they enter into our doors. So just being aware of that, starting to realize that, I think is super important, and also realize the courage that it's taking for them to even just step back in, and also validating that maybe that's too hard for a season. Negative emotions and cognitions. This includes just a persistent inability to experience positive emotions. think happiness, satisfaction, loving feelings, feelings of detachment or estrangement with others, kind of pulling away from community, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities, an inability to remember an important aspect of the event, persistent, exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world. You may start hearing friends start to say something like, which alter it, of course, to their language, what sounds true to them. I am bad. No one can be trusted. The world is completely dangerous. Persistent, distorted cognitions about the causes or consequences of the trauma that leads them to blame themselves or other people. And then this persistent negative emotional state could be fear, horror, guilt, anger, shame. Those are pretty common ones. We also see hyperarousal. So if we think about Liam and his tendency for angry outbursts, super, super common. Reckless, self-destructive behavior, many addictions fall into that. Again, difficulties falling or staying asleep, problems with concentration, that prefrontal cortex where we plan and think. With trauma survivors, it's often not online or not online as much as it could be because our amygdala is so activated. Hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response, and then disassociation, feeling disconnected from yourself, the world around you, when people may be describing as like, I just feel far away, it feels like I'm in a tunnel, feel detached from my body. Yes, and PTSD is also linked to a host of physical illnesses. It is wild with the research that I've been doing throughout my time at school and just different things that I've been learning. There is an increased presence of, they do this ACE study that talks about childhood adverse experiences. And with each experience leads to an increased risk of things like obesity, smoking, cancer, gastrointestinal disease, heart disease, autoimmune disease, migraines, lupus, so many different health problems. It is, it's remarkable. That may be scary, but we have hope and we will get to that later in the webinar. So, what is the difference between trauma and complex trauma? Maybe you've never heard this term and it's super new and you're like, Amanda, I'm confused. What's happening? So remember, again, we have this big giant wound with trauma, and complex trauma is harder to identify because there may not be this one given event, right? Like what we talked about with the car wreck or this life-threatening illness. Rather, it's these million tiny paper cuts that accumulate over time to make this big giant gash. And it's really important for us to remember that trauma isn't just the result of being exposed to something awful. Trauma is the result of not getting the care or nourishment that you need after that exposure. That's what makes it trauma. And so our bodies are designed to heal, but if we don't get the care that we need after that exposure to a traumatic event, those chemicals that course through our body that give us that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response that we need in the moment, these stay in our bodies, like what we were just talking about when spiritual abuse survivors are walking back into the church. And so we don't return to that calm-centered place. We may not even know what a calm-centered place feels like. And so that is what happens with post-traumatic stress. You're exposed to a trauma, you come home, all of a sudden you're just supposed to be this normal person, but your body is saying, no, something terrible happened and I'm not okay. And so like with Liam, we see his body is still responding to this little moment with his wife, this fight, and it's not a traumatic incident, right? He's just having a disagreement with his wife, or his wife isn't, meeting him or responding in the way that he would like her to. He's responding based on how his body was conditioned by this traumatic event in the past that never really got healed. And so think about it this way with complex trauma. Maybe you're someone who, or maybe you know somebody that's why you attended this webinar tonight, who wasn't exposed to a one-time traumatic event. Maybe you were exposed to constant neglect as a child. Maybe you weren't cared for emotionally or physically. Maybe you were exposed to constant patterns of bullying or manipulation. Maybe you were raised by a caregiver who was addicted or mentally ill. And so there was this constant environment around you of these million tiny paper cuts. And these million tiny paper cuts begin to have an impact on your soul and on your body. And so it's this chronic, pervasive exposure over time to pain, to being mistreated, to toxicity. And these traumatic events, when it comes to complex trauma, they tend to happen in the context of interpersonal relationships. And so we can see here some examples of what complex trauma is. It's more than just actual or threatened death. Usually with complex trauma, we have the acts of omission that we talked about, acts of commission, when trusted caregivers, they know or they're suspect that something may be happening to us and they don't step in to protect us. Emotional abuse, any kind of substance use in the home, poverty, bullying. And so, complex trauma, it tends to happen with our primary caregivers. But not only with our primary caregivers, it can happen and does happen throughout the course of people's lives. It happens in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our churches, in our schools. It's when people are misunderstood consistently, labeled, marginalized consistently. And so people are exposed to these constant paper cuts to the soul, and these early injuries really impact the way that we develop. They affect our core sense of self, especially when no one comes in and guides us through them appropriately. And so survivors of complex trauma, they start to take themselves to be less than. They start to take themselves to be not good enough and start to develop an identity around this experience of constantly being mistreated or unseen or shoved aside. And this is what we mean by complex trauma. It's complex because it's woven into a lot of the different fibers of our being, maybe even every fiber of our being, depending on how much care we got apart from these painful experiences. And so you may be sitting here, you may be thinking, okay, this is all like really great information, Amanda, but I just don't think I know anyone who's experienced something like that. And so I would just want to gently challenge you. Maybe you're thinking that you or someone you know had a halfway normal family on the surface. Maybe other people, looking inside of your family would be like, look, there's a mom, there's a dad, there's a sibling, you had your needs met, you had dinner every night. It looks normal on the outside. Who would describe that as trauma? But on the inside of the family, there were these million tiny paper cuts that happened over time. It could be criticism, manipulation, neglect, so many different things that it could be. But the point is that you didn't get the nourishment or care that you needed. And so your sense of self isn't quite formed in the way that it could be. And when we start to really understand what complex trauma is, and the reason I'm focusing on that so much instead of like the big giant wound of traumas, I think it's actually more pervasive in our culture than the one-time big trauma. It helps us provide a strength-based and survival-driven reframe that helps shift the focus from what's wrong with this person to what happened to you. Because the symptoms that we're seeing, that intrusion, hyperarousal, negative cognitions and emotions, avoidance, those things, they're adaptive strategies to survive overwhelming experiences and prepare for ongoing threat in a hostile world. They were so smart. Trauma survivors are so smart because they found a way to survive. And so as we step in as the body and believers of Christ, we can hopefully help ourselves have that reframe and be able to move towards people with more compassion. And so we've been talking about a lot of heavy stuff, and I know it can feel like, whew, this is a lot. And maybe we want to run away from that. And I think broadly, the Western church, the American church can often spiritually bypass that pain and trauma. We don't want to lean into it. And we forget that the places touched by death are the places Christ chose to go. He chose to move towards people who felt abandoned and angry and afraid. We see it with the Gospels all over in the New Testament. Jesus touching the leper in Matthew 8, Jesus healing a blind man in John 9, Jesus healing Jairus' daughter who had already passed away. And when we think of even the cultural context of that, the historical cultural context, how he's massively breaking these cleansing rituals to move towards these people and subverting cultural norms, we can begin to see how he really did press into these people that required more emotional energy and that were deemed unworthy from society. And so I think as we think through like faith, we think through hope and joy and how we want, right, to give that to people and instill that in people who are survivors of trauma or complex trauma. I think it's important to remember that they aren't built, faith, hope, and joy, they aren't built on believing the reality that you're experiencing right now as scary or hard or traumatic is actually okay because God is good and everything's going to work together for your good. I think that faith is the practice of paying attention to our lives as worthy of attunement in places God is offering us solidarity and presence. And I'll get into that more in a second, but really pressing and leaning into these moments. And again, I think this is just critical for us as believers to really think through and consider and wrestle with, because when someone experiences a traumatic event, when they've walked through and survived complex trauma, of course that is going to bring up immense doubt and anger and fear and confusion. And we even see it in Deuteronomy with the Israelites, right? They have been through a horrendous situation. They have been plucked out of that, right, by God when they moved from years and years and years of slavery, physical abuse. I'm sure there was verbal abuse as well, most likely sexual assaults in that, and had no sense of identity, no sense of autonomy over their lives, probably not being cared for well, having their basic needs met, and they are removed, and now they're in the wilderness, gone on their merry way, 40-year-long journey to the promised land. And they find themselves asking this question: is the Lord among us or not? They are parched in the desert sun. They are just wandering around in the wilderness and grumbling and questioning the goodness of God's salvation, asking, why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? And I think we're very similar to the Israelites. We strain to see salvation in the deserts of our discouragement. We echo their exasperation. And I think very often we can expect salvation to mean that God will pluck us up out of difficulty and just plop us down into prosperity. Again, this tendency to this term spiritual bypassing, where we just kind of want to skirt around that pain and move towards the end goal. But I think as believers and as we're trying to be people who emulate Christ and who embody who he was and who he is, that means following him into every place that he regarded worthy of his hands and his heart and his time, all the way to the cross. This means following him into places of hunger and thirst, to tend to the lepers of our days on the edges of town, to receive water from women labeled too promiscuous to belong, and to sit with and accept and create a sense of belonging for those deemed too disordered or dirty to be in our churches. I believe that really following Jesus means walking the wilderness way, trusting along with him that God is among us and will quench our thirst. And so again, you may be thinking, okay, great, like we have the solution. We're going to lean into the spiritual side of things. And so, like, what's the deal with counselors? Why are you in grad school? Why should I approach a psychiatrist or anything like that? And I think it's important to remember that we are not only spiritual beings, right? We have physical bodies, and our bodies are deeply impacted by trauma. Our emotions are affected by trauma. Our thought life is affected by trauma, right? When we looked at those symptoms, when we looked at all the different what am I trying to find the word for? All the different health conditions that are linked to traumatic events. And so we need spiritual solutions, but we also need a whole toolkit of solutions, psychological, emotional, physiological. And so just keeping that in mind as we keep going. So we have kind of this foundation. What is trauma? What is complex trauma? What does it look like? Why should we care? And now I think we got to move into applying it. And the key thing here is safety. I will say it over and over and over again. Safety and stabilization is the first thing you do with anyone who has walked through trauma, because what establishes trauma from an everyday experience is that fundamental sense of safety that was stolen from them. And without safety, the body is stuck in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. And so as we realize the widespread impact of trauma, we can be cognizant, that when we're volunteering in kids on Sunday, we could be with someone who is walking through this. When we're worshiping on a Sunday morning, there is a chance that there are many people in that room with us who are experiencing the impacts of this. When we're in community group, when we're praying over one another, people we're ministering to and alongside of, it is impacting us all throughout our church. Recognizing the symptoms, that's a big, important part of it. And then responding by embodying Christ through sitting with and referring when appropriate. And so here is what you don't say. A safe person does not say, I will rescue you. They do not think I will rescue you. Enneagram 2s, I know that may be even more difficult for you guys. I'm an Enneagram 1 wing 2, so I feel it, but that is not something that safe people do. We want to practice being the friend who embodies the truth of God's goodness and our willingness to sit with compassion in the dark. We want to be the friend who reminds others as they are telling us about this experience of sexual assault that their sibling just went through, that they don't have to say, but God is good. We want to be the friend who, when they learned that their parent or their sibling just committed suicide, we don't want to respond with God is in control. We want to remind others, I should say, they don't have to say these things, that everything will work out. Our presence trumps these platitudes, and it is a full prayer, guys. It is a literal full prayer. I'm not okay is sacred speech that we should honor and anoint as holy. And so some of y'all may be freaking out. And that's not my intention. My intention is not that God isn't good. Of course, he is a good and perfect and holy God. But it is that our very good bodies that were designed and created by God were literally made to receive goodness neurobiologically in the middle of our grief and groans through physical presence first. So how's this done? It's done through a process called co-regulation. And parents may have heard about this a little bit. If you're not a parent, then we'll do a little psycho ed. Co-regulation is where one nervous system calms another. So it happens when a caregiver who is attuned to their children, the children use their parents' bodies the tone and pitch of their voice, their breath to anchor safety for them and to calm themselves down. And over time, this ability to calm down, it really becomes internalized, and the child can calm themselves down using the parent's internalized voice. And there's literally a cellular memory of what it feels like to be calm when something scary is happening. It's the coolest thing. But when we haven't received this kind of attunement as a child, and right when we think about complex trauma, especially, those people probably did not receive that attunement. It can be difficult to calm ourselves down in any triggering event as an adult. And so we'll start to see those post-traumatic stress symptoms that we talked about earlier. But the beautiful thing about how our bodies were designed is when a nervous system with little co-regulation starts to receive it as an adult, that nervous system will actually learn to regulate itself still. It's not like you miss this window and you can no longer be on this boat, like people are waving across the sea, like, hi, we have regulated nervous systems, you don't. That is not how it is. But we do reach the limits of individual personal development work. Trauma survivors do. And so at this stage, they really need to be in relationships with people who can love them enough to help them learn co-regulation and eventually self-regulation. And so as the body of Christ, that is a really practical way that we can start to step in. Of course, counselors play a huge role in this as well. I tell my clients, it's like you're borrowing my nervous system for an hour. That's what you're paying for. I mean, it's more than that, but that is a big thing of it. And so when we prematurely offer this positivity or platitudes, it can dismiss a person's real pain and displace their need for that pain, their ability to start to actually learn that co-regulation, and be soothed by your kind face, by your gentle voice, by your grounded presence. And nourishment, when we're in these places, this grief, these groans, it really starts with our needs. And life starts in the dark. Priest and author Barbara Brown Taylor reminds us that whether it is a seed in the ground, a baby in the womb, or Jesus in the tomb, new life starts in the dark. And so what's really important is we need to remember when we bypass the darkness, we actually kill the courage, the immense courage that it takes for a trauma survivor to even start to name that to someone else. When we avoid anguish, we are bypassing healing. We have to literally, there's this phrase called name it to tame it, feel it to heal it. Just type it in Google and you can find all these fun, I'm super into neurobiology. You can find a lot of different things about how our bodies are literally like naming and feeling moves us toward healing. When we anesthetize, when we numb people's ache and our ache, we end up letting wounds fester that could actually be the place of our greatest healing and hope. Because they could move towards the ability to actually co-regulate for themselves, to start to build up that nervous system on their own, and be able to handle traumatic situations that will come in their future life. And so we don't need fixes. We really need friendship. We don't need a list of truth or tasks. We need tenderness. Before our bodies are ready to receive scripture as the solace that it is, we need to experience the truth with skin. Scripture embodied in the syllables of shared sighs and tears, someone sitting with us in the darkness until the light feels real enough for us to rise. And so you may be thinking about someone or have someone in your life, or maybe it is you, where you feel real frustrated by the fact that they seem to be moving forward and then they move 10 steps backward and they're all over the place. And you're like, what is going on, Amanda? We need to remember that recovering from trauma, it takes time. It is not linear healing. It looks like, for all of y'all who have littles, like when they're drawing, half the time you don't even know what it is. It's like that. It's like this scribble. It is not like a bar graph that's straight. I don't even know if bar graph's the right word. That's not my strong suit. So feel free to correct me if that's wrong. And so we have this far off telos that we are very familiar with as believers. And as a reminder, or for those who may not know, Telos means an end, a fulfillment. It's the branch of theology that is really concerned with the final events in the history of the world or humankind. And so as Christians, we have some practice in waiting for our far off telos. We know much of the story of faith, but we have yet to see God's eschatological plan actually come to fruition. We can predict, we can imagine, we can dream, but we don't know the ending for sure. We don't know the day when Jesus is going to come back. And so remembering that the telos of current events lies in God can take the burden off us to offer answers in times of trauma or to rush through the meaning-making process. We may start focus on asking open-ended questions that help us to establish safety, because, right, that's a huge part of it. We want to establish safety as a prelude to the work of meaning-making. So we may be asking, if I'm hearing you right, you don't feel spiritually safe right now. Could you tell me more about that? Or what do you need to feel safe right now? And one of the most significant impacts of suffering from trauma is the stigma associated with needing help to deal with this traumatic experience. It often is what prevents people from seeking help. And we can play just a vital role in reducing this shame by reminding those suffering from trauma that actually reaching out for help is a sign of strength, and it is nothing to be ashamed about, because we want to be people who offer compassion. We don't heal in the context of shame and judgment. We only heal in the context of compassion. And even for people who, if you're older and you're realizing, hey, like my spouse may have actually walked through complex trauma, a lot of things are starting to click for me. Is it too late? I think for us to remember as people of faith, we believe the soul lives forever. And so we have forever to live these new healed lives as healing people. And so it's just never, ever too late to start healing. We have forever to continue this process and to become the whole people that God made us to become. So tying it all together, again, safety, safety, safety. That's anything you take from this webinar. I hope it is safety. We need to establish it in ourselves if we are trauma survivors, with God, and in relationships. So with ourselves, this really starts with naming. I've been through a lot in my life, and I have got to stop beating myself up. I have to stop blaming myself. I have to start getting curious about all these paper cuts that have become my soul, about the pain of what sometimes feels like this shredded soul that I have inside of me. I have to stop minimizing that, and I have to start saying, Lord, this is what I see. Help me take that first step. And then we have to find safety with God, because God does not shame us. And I will say that again, because it is so important. He does not shame us. He says, I know what you have been through. I have seen it. I was there with you, even though you maybe didn't feel me there with you. It's okay. And it's not too much for me. I am with you. And so you may start to understand the reasons why you react the way you do, why you may have developed a substance abuse issue, why you have an anger management issue, why you avoid relationships, or you're constantly people pleasing. Understanding why helps you show compassion for yourself. And it's how I believe God starts to show up with us. And hear me out. It is not that God says, that's great that you do that, keep doing it. That is not it. But it is that God comes alongside you and says, yes, I get it. Of course you do this thing. Of course there is a reason. And this is so important to remember. There is no shame in the way that God puts his finger on those areas of our lives that need healing. There is compassion. So we name it without shame. And it doesn't mean we get to say, well, I'll just always be this way. Amanda told me recovering from trauma takes time. It means we say, oh, I've got to go on a journey of healing, and that healing may take a long time. And we start to talk about it differently. We might say, yes, I do struggle with anger, and I may lash out at you, and I'm sorry when I do. Here's why I do that. It doesn't make it okay, and I want you to know that I'm working on it, but I also just want you to understand where I'm coming from in my story. And then we also need to reestablish safety and relationships. That does not mean finding this safe mythical unicorn that's just magically going to make us feel better. No one human being can be that safe. They are going to let us down. What I mean by finding safety in another person is finding another person who is honest. And as we think of trying to be these honest people, it's becoming the kinds of people who can hold space for someone as they say, I need you to know that my soul is feeling kind of shredded. I've been through a lot and I'm doing my best to heal, but every once in a while, these things will happen and you'll see me fold into the shame spiral. You might see me run away. You might see me doubt you when you haven't done anything that's untrustworthy. And I just need you to know that. And so here's what a safe person does. A safe person says, I see you, and that's okay. I'll hold space for you. And guess what? Here's the wounds that I bring to the table. Again, we do not offer to be their rescuer. And so you go on this process of together honoring and holding space for one another and healing together, because as the old adage says, and it's cliche, but it is true, shared sorrow is half the sorrow. When you can share your pain with someone else who sees you and they don't set themselves up as your rescuer, as your healer, but instead they come alongside you and say, I know, I get it. I see you. I am not afraid. And I honor those parts of you. And guess what? I've got some of my own, and we can honor each other in this. So let's try another story. And you may notice that after what you've learned about trauma, complex trauma, the impacts of it, you may have more understanding about why someone may be responding in a certain way. You may notice less reactivity in your body and your emotions. So yeah, again, just be curious as you listen. So like Liam, Olivia lashes out at her close friends and coworkers over trivial things and has big emotional reactions to seemingly real small interpersonal infractions. But unlike a lot of people, Olivia doesn't just feel guilt around her emotions. It goes beyond just feeling bad for her actions, which is actually informative and it's helpful emotion for us to feel. It sends us an appropriate message. It turns into this crippling shame. And so the difference between guilt and shame is essential here. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, something is wrong with me. I am something wrong. And so Olivia finds herself thinking, why are my emotions so big? Why do I react in such a big way? What is wrong with me? I feel like there is something wrong with me. And so we began to see how shame comes into it, how it can be toxic, it's devastating, it's big when you've survived complex trauma. And Olivia feels a lot of shame because she has this overwhelming sense that something is wrong with her. And so instead of turning towards her support by having an honest yet difficult conversation with her close friend of like, hey, I'm noticing these symptoms and these things that are happening, these patterns, can you help me? She withdraws and she isolates herself. She throws herself into her work. She's always finding something to do. She is never facing what is so often difficult for trauma survivors is the potential to be hurt again in a relationship by sharing honestly about what is going on, because we are hurt in relationships. That is also how we heal. So Olivia is walking in shame as a result of her unhealed wounds. And as we learned earlier, one of the things Olivia has to do is to recognize shame for what it is. It is just shame. It doesn't have the real story that Olivia is beloved, that she has been through something really hard and that it's not her fault. So Olivia grew up in a home with married parents who loved her deeply, but they did not love each other. There was a lot of animosity. They decided to stay in the marriage for the sake of for their children, but her parents fought a lot. And when her mom would express her feelings to her dad, he would mock her, call her a drama queen, other sorts of names. And he often even would stonewall her, literally acting as if she did not exist, staring straight through her at the game on the television while she tried to vulnerably share her emotions. And when he was really upset with her, he wouldn't talk to anyone in the family. And this meant days, weeks, once even a month of Olivia's dad not speaking a word to her or anyone else in her home. And through this, Olivia now struggles to understand her own emotions and, of course, the emotions of others around her. She's learned that when there's conflict in relationship, you disconnect by ignoring the other's presence. You stonewall. She's terrified of being vulnerable, and she's put on this defensive act and attempt to protect herself. And because of this invalidation and emotional neglect, Olivia now experiences deficits in attention and self-awareness. When she's engaging in those coping mechanisms, withdrawing, overworking, busying herself, she does not even realize it. It impacts her self-perception, her self-esteem, how she takes herself to be. And again, this gets at this idea of shame. She has lost connection with that core sense of self. Remember, complex trauma is woven into the very fibers of our being. And so she said she's not someone that can say, oh, I blew it in the moment, but I'm okay. I can reset. I can come back to home base. I fundamentally trust myself. And yes, I can get off kilter. We all do. That fundamental sense of self is just really hard to access if you had this pervasive pattern of a million tiny paper cuts of complex trauma. And this even bleeds into the way that Olivia believes God sees her. She thinks there's something wrong with me. Why can't I just be like other people? She's not able to say, oh man, I have been through a lot. I respond in this way for a reason. And there's some way in which I respond to people that I need to get curious about. And she's just in this cycle and pattern of beating herself up. And so as Olivia experiences these big emotions that she doesn't know what to do with, she starts to notice significant distress in how she shows up in her relationships with other people. She might begin to notice a lot of anxiety. She's noticing a fear of people leaving her. She's starting to distrust herself and her ability to be loved and to receive love. And she began to may have some ideas about relationships that are idealized, like, I just need that one safe, mythical, magical unicorn that's going to make everything okay. Because she doesn't know how to trust herself, she starts to avoid people altogether. She starts to think, nobody is trustworthy. I can't let people in. As opposed to healthy dependence, which is nobody is completely trustworthy, but I trust myself enough to know that I'll advocate for myself when I need to. And again, we're coming back to that core sense of self that empowers her, equips her, gives her that confidence to know how to discern safety in other people and how to protect herself when she bumps up against toxicity. There is a self-trust that is lacking because there was no one there to teach her how to do that. And so maybe you're thinking, Amanda, this is great information. Maybe you're thinking, I have a friend like Olivia, or I have a friend like Liam, but I do not have the capacity to help this person. This is out of my wheelhouse. And first, I just want to validate you that walking alongside of people who are dealing with post-traumatic stress, it can weigh on you, and you are not meant to do it alone. And so if you begin to notice that your friend or loved one, someone in your community group, is engaging in behaviors that concern you and seem to point towards a trauma response, addictive behaviors such as pornography addiction, eating disorders, disordered eating, perfectionism, panic attacks, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, numbness, codependency, depression, there's a lot, anxiety. And these get to a point where it becomes particularly self-destructive and you've seen a pattern. It's time to have an honest conversation with them. And how do we do that? It should always be done one-on-one or in the presence of a spouse if it's an opposite gender situation. Never, ever, ever in a group setting. And we can start to prepare ourselves for that person to potentially take offense, and remember that is not a sign that you made the wrong decision to suggest any kind of therapy or referral. Because often that you may be the first person who is confronting them about this, and they may not be ready to face it. Also, people can be very defensive of their coping mechanisms because, again, it is the adaptive strategy that helped them survive very hard situations. And so they don't want to let that go. And so, a way to actually have this conversation, I would always encourage to use I statements of, I have noticed these behaviors of perfectionism and busying and overworking yourself that have started to kind of seem to get out of control. And this makes me feel concerned and worried and frightened about you. Or maybe you're noticing, hey, I'm noticing you're disengaging from community group. You've really stopped and pulled yourself back from all your support. And I hear that you're not really even doing the kinds of things that you used to love. I'm worried. That makes me feel worried. And you can come with a list of a few names of people that they could maybe set up a time to talk with them. Explain how there's free 10 to 15-minute consultations. Say, I will sit with you as you make this phone call. And I want you to know this is important here. I'm not leaving you in this situation. I want to continue walking alongside you. I just know that I'm reaching my limits of how I can help you walk through this well. And so here are some referrals. North Point has a phenomenal resource where you can type in what you are hoping to get counseling for, or an approach if you're really interested in EMDR or psychodynamic, all the different theories. You can find a counselor there. I will also shamelessly plug the places that I work at. I cannot be your counselor because we attend the same church, but there are wonderful counselors at both of these sites. And Hope Counseling Centers is actually partnered with churches around the city of Atlanta. So if you're, not close to Roswell or Woodstock, there's most likely a Hope Counseling Center that is near you. We also have books listed here. KJ Ramsey, The Lord is My Courage, and Try Softer are both by believers. The rest are secular, but phenomenal resources. Just really, really great. And then if you're an auditory learner and that you do better digesting things through that way, the place we find ourselves is, again, a great podcast, He's a Believer. And as we wrap up, I just think we want to be careful, because trauma and complex trauma is not all of who we are. These are descriptions of our experiences of pain and suffering, which is so important to get right. It is, but it is, and we are more than a diagnostic label. We are. And while these descriptions are important, we are still beautiful souls who are made in God's image, and our souls can heal. It may take a lifetime, depending on the level and severity of the trauma that someone we know or ourselves have been through, but our soul is beautiful. And if this diagnostic category is helpful for you to go, I think that fits me. I think my trauma was complex. It was an exposure to a whole lot of different things over a period of time. That's still describing your experience. It is not the sum total of who you are. And so this label can really help you understand why you show up in the world in certain ways, why you show up in relationships in certain ways, why certain emotions seem to take you over, why you struggle with so much shame, why it's hard for you to trust a spouse that it is in fact trustworthy, why you want to run away when you know what you really need to do is to have that hard conversation. These help us understand the why of these things, but they don't ultimately define our core self. And so let's be the kind of people who learn to suffer well with our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. May we walk into spaces with a new perspective, entering into one another's pain and anointing it as holy and sticking around no matter the outcome. We may not ever be cured from the impact of post-traumatic stress on this side of heaven, but we are always worthy of healing, and we are always worthy of hope. And so may we be the kind of people who embody that hope for others. That is all I have. So lay on the questions.
Wow. Thanks, Amanda. I first want to ask, how difficult was it to just speak to kind of no one in particular? No, right? You're not getting that like feedback. Was that? How'd
It's
that go for you?
hard. It is harder than I thought. I don't love online things. I do not
Sure.
like telehealth. I try and push all my clients to be in person, so
Yeah.
it is difficult. I hope there are
I hear you.
humans out there in the World Wide Web listening to
Yeah.
this somewhere.
I think they are, though I haven't heard from those humans yet. So just as a reminder, if you have any questions, it is 9:30, so we will wrap up here soon. Just to, um, yeah, so you can go do your things. But any questions you have, just throw it in the chat. You can also email me, Amanda, Nick afterwards as well. I had one question though. Well, first of all, I want to say that really was beautiful. Thank you. Even your last, I was taking notes all the way through the end. I love that at the end, just the invitation to learn to suffer well with others, entering one another's pain. Beautiful. And yeah, I think we at RCC, we want to be that type of people. I really appreciate the quote too, when you're talking about when we avoid anguish, we bypass healing. I think that's such a good reminder that we need healing. I mean, that is a humble, vulnerable perspective, a biblical one, that we need to be healed. And when we don't think about the ways that we've been impacted by the brokenness of the world, and we just try to move on,
Yeah.
we actually miss that healing. So
Yeah.
thank you for that reminder.
Yeah.
So like, how do we do this? Look at some of our suffering and trauma without becoming too self-centered, and maybe like if we notice it in ourselves or notice it in someone else, or it's just like that's all we're doing is just like looking at the trauma. Have you noticed and had people that have done that? And I guess what would your advice be? What's the balance there of a healthy way to like look at that but not just be stuck in it?
Yeah, I think it's an important question to ask and to consider. I think for trauma survivors, I am one, so I'm just going to say we often have led our lives for so long not paying attention to those parts of us that have been traumatized and experienced this suffering. And I'll explain this to clients is it's like a pendulum. And so we've been living like on this end where our needs don't matter, our feelings don't matter, and we don't pay attention to it. We put other people first and other priorities first. And so there is usually a season, I'm new to counseling, so take that for what it is, but that I am noticing in my clients where we really swing to that other end. And so we can seem more consumed by it.
Mhm.
And what I would say is to notice that of like, hey, I'm in this season where I am prioritizing myself and my needs. I'm saying no to more things. But if that, continues to go on for years, that is concerning. I think it just takes a minute to move back into that healthy middle because we've lived on extremes for so long that we need to learn how to actually become a healthy human being, which takes time. And it really just depends on the level and severity of trauma. I know I hate the answer, it depends, but it does depend.
No, well, that's the thing. Yeah, there's not an easy answer, but yeah, that was helpful and clarifying. Thanks.
Yeah.
We've got so no questions, or really, I guess one question is, why are you so awesome, Amanda? A lot of good feedback. Great job, really helpful. Love that you kept pointing to God, moving into and toward the hard places. And I certainly, agree there. Jesus entered into our pain and suffering with us. I love the reminder that God does not shame us for the things that we've experienced.
Yeah. Yes.
Hmm.
Thanks for the encouraging words.
Yeah. Well, anything else from you as we wrap up?
Um, I don't think so. I think just encouraging everyone to kind of consider, we are called to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And if we're not taking the time to be introspective and to care for those parts of us that have endured something, and care for other people who have endured suffering, just be curious how that is really being loving to yourself or someone else. Just a little challenge.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, in light of time, I will go ahead and wrap up the webinar. But Amanda, thank you so much. You're a gift to our community, and just super glad that you're learning what you're learning and that you were able to share that with us. For all the attendees out there, you'll see Amanda in the pews, so you can feel free to ask her anything or say good job next time you see her. So again, she'll be sending out an email after the webinar at some point in the future. You'll see a brief survey. She'll also include the slides. And at a later time, we'll basically take the recording, upload it to the RCC website, and we'll basically just make you aware of that. So with that, that's all we got. Thanks for joining, and have a great night.